The Florida Podcast Network, the voice of Florida.
From Mallory Square in Key West to the Governor's Mansion in Tallahassee and all points beyond, you're listening to the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com, your source for all things related to the craft beer community in the Sunshine State. And now your host, Dave Butler.
Welcome to another episode of the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com. This is Dave, your host and author. By now, hopefully you have all had a great October 14th. And I choose that date because so many things were going on in the state, and I find that just kind of humorous. We were at the Treasure Coast Wine and Ale Trail Festival in Fort Pierce. Again, we're going to have some audio from that later on in the month, and just as usual, it's a fantastic time. You missed it if you didn't come out this year. I'm sure it'll be back around again in 2024, maybe even bigger. It tends to grow, which is always a great thing to see when it comes to small local businesses in the craft beer and community. I said craft beering. I'm not feeling great. I was feeling a lot better when we did this recording. This is going to be part one of a two-part series at High Springs Brewing in High Springs, Florida. If you've never heard of High Springs Brewing or High Springs, Florida, I don't blame you. It's probably best known as being the home of Ginny Springs, which is a great place to go cave diving and also river tubing, which is something I have not done in decades. And it's obviously home of High Springs Brewing. Now, I had been to what was supposed to have been the original location for High Springs Brewing many years ago. In fact, it was their co-founder and head brewer, Kiffin Ayers, that showed it to me, and they were actually in the process of leaving. They had found what was in the process of ending its life as an ironwork factory near downtown High Springs, next to a beautiful open green, which on the other side had what I can assume were the remains of a peanut mill. Somebody may have to correct me on that. Anyways, that was going to be the location for High Springs Brewing when it finally opened up. Time has passed, and that is exactly what has happened. It has been cleaned up quite a bit. It has been changed from a factory to what is fast becoming a central point for the entire High Springs, Florida community. And they are doing a fantastic job. So we sat down with Kiffin and his brewer, Ekasala, to talk about High Springs Brewing, creating the location, cleaning it up, and starting a brewery in a city where there were no breweries before, but shares the same county as Gainesville, which is becoming kind of a big, important city when it comes to Florida craft beer. I will say, if you have been there, you'll understand that everything is outside. It is basically a gigantic patio, and it was raining, so it's probably going to start sounding a little bit rainy here in a little bit. But it's still a great interview, great time. Very happy to finally get Kiffin on the podcast. He has been on the podcast before, about a year or so ago, with a card game, a beer brewing card game that he had created. But it's great to talk to him finally about High Springs Brewing. So here we go with Kiffin and Evan, High Springs Brewing in High Springs, Florida, along with our field producer, Steve, who tends to go to High Springs Brewing on a fairly regular basis. And I completely see why. Enjoy. Can you define High Springs? Because when we met a couple of years ago, you had the best description of what High Springs is.
The city or the brewery?
The city. We're gonna set the scene for anybody that may not have heard of High Springs, which is
absolutely
probably a good chunk of people.
So High Springs is nestled between Gainesville and Lake City, and really only has a kind of the claim to fames that it's had over time have been some of the local restaurants and then the springs that are nearby. And having a couple of major roads running through have really kind of helped it to stay on the map. And it's a community that is made up of people that have been here for a very long time and people that have moved from other parts of Florida, a lot of South Florida, that have relocated up here because of the nature aspects, being close to rivers, being close to the springs, and still having access to the east and west coast, and
not being too crowded.
And it not being too crowded.
Let's keep it that way.
So if you're listening to this episode,
That's
don't
right.
come. Well, I guess
Just to the brewery.
Gotcha. So I guess what was it about this? I guess we'll use the stereotypical term of sleepy, small North Central Florida town that just needed a brewery.
I think for us, we had family that moved into this area. I'm originally from Gainesville, and we had family that moved into High Springs. And so it seemed like a nice distance away from Gainesville to integrate another brewery into the mix without being too crowded. And the being very tourist focused, there was an opportunity to provide for that group of people that would come through, as well as the regulars, the locals that are here.
Yeah. I met Kiffin and then I moved here. So
Awesome. So it's close enough to Gainesville. Do you consider yourselves to be a part of the Gainesville beer scene, or are you separate enough and different enough to where you are basically your own entity?
Yes.
I'd say so, yeah.
Both, because we're included in, because we're in Alachua County, we're included in everything nearby within our beer family of Alachua County, but we're also far enough out that we really have a lot of autonomy to the things that we're doing, because we're not close enough to really, collab or know what's going on in town. So we kind of have a disconnect in our day-to-day, but in the overall, we're included in the Sip and Seven and other events that happen, the Beer Fest and other activities that occur. We're invited because we're part of this area, which really stems from Pekala to Lake City. And that's the kind of this 75 corridor is we're a part of that family, but the day to day is pretty much we're kind of on our own.
Gotcha. So I guess the team of you that opened High Springs Brewing, how did the conversation get started? Because this is a big undertaking and not one to be totally taken lightly. And you've had some bumps along the way. So let's start at the beginning. How did that conversation begin?
Okay, without going
too crazy.
We converged out here in High Springs as a result of my home brewing, and brother and brother-in-laws wanted to learn the process. And so we just started hanging out and making beer. And then we decided, hey, why don't we give this a shot? And it would be a lot better to do this and fail at it than to look back in 5 years or however many years and say, gosh, I wish I'd have done that. And somebody else, do it. And so we started having those conversations in 2016, and then we established the business in 2017. and secured 1,000 square foot warehouse about a mile from our current location, and ran into different issues that prevented us from finalizing that location. We had everything inside ready to what we understood ready meant at the time, and we were not able to connect into the septic, and so as a result, we had to explore getting out of that lease and finding a new location. We learned a lot about what we needed through that experience, and so it really made some locations not an option. And we always kind of drove by the old welding shop and dreamed of it being the perfect spot for the brewery, but it was being rented out to other welders, and it was being used. It wasn't on the market, and it finally got on the market. We had an opportunity to go through the process of acquiring it, and then in the winter, I guess in January of 2019, we bought the welding shop, and then in July of 2019, we were officially open to the public after a couple of soft openings and exploring that. Then we pretty much 9 months after we opened, we were shut down on St. Patrick's Day 2020, and all the practice that we did leading up to that day was thwarted for a few months while we were all in the process of trying to pivot and decide what we were going to do with the brewery and how we were going to proceed
and where you're going. How much improvements and upgrades can you do to the current brewery?
Right. And during that time when we were kind of forced to stop, any dream or any kind of thought was like put on hold, because you not knowing where's the end to this. And so it progressively changed, and now here we are in July, will be 4 years, being open to the public and beginning to find out what normal is with, the patrons coming in and the things the activities that we're going to do on a regular basis.
So I kind of want to go back a little bit and talk about this location, because I've never seen a brewery that has reused such a bizarre building as you did. And when you first showed it to me, it was, incredibly dark and, the middle of nowhere. Never really met you before. It was a little less like, Leave It to Beaver, and it was a little more like Saw. So I didn't know if I was going to be
shady.
It totally was, because it was. I mean, it's a welding spot, so it's not going to be bright at all, anyways.
Right.
What was it about this location that said brewery?
Well,
the yard.
Yeah, I was gonna say the yard. Only place downtown with the yard.
And
Pretty important.
And it's a pretty sizable yard.
Yeah. It's also, I think, one of the largest plots downtown, right?
Yeah. At a half an acre, it's being fenced in. It's makes it very unique to any of the other restaurants or businesses, because it's perfect for having your children kind of play in the grass, and you're able to sit at a picnic table and you're not concerned because it's all fenced in and it's all open air. And so that's been one of our strengths over the last few years, is being predominantly open air.
When that fence came with the location that was put in by the previous owners, correct?
Yes.
The fence, yeah.
Barbed wire and all.
No, I mean, obviously the barbed wire's been taken down, but
That's and more electricity than you could imagine. So
which is good for you for a
it
brew
was,
system.
it's great for expansion. You know, we've got the 3-phase if we really need it. So, which I guess we will.
And who were the previous owners? Only because the gates up front, which don't open a whole lot, it's got the AA on there. I would assume that was left over.
Archie's Welding. Yeah, we purchased it from Archie. He was retiring and he had begun renting it out. He was ready to part ways with the property, and so we kind of went through a vetting process, and he liked us a lot, and so we were able to acquire the building from him. And the previous location was the warehouse with 1,000 square feet and a small parking lot. Based on how we had it laid out, it probably would have held about 15 people.
Yeah, because there wasn't a whole lot of space. There wasn't any parking at all. It wasn't even really visible. You would have had to have some sort of signage or something.
And so that's how naive we were at the time. And when we saw this place, we were like, it's so open and there's so much room, so much room for activities, and being able to have a 3,000 square foot building with a 2,000 square foot awning, we were like, this is already enormous. And here we are 4 years later, and we're beginning to outgrow it and beginning to understand a little bit more how to use our space and the kind of things that we may need kind of moving forward, but always trying to preserve the yard, because that's one of those, the fixture pieces.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of potential inside the brewery to expand if we just manage the space a little bit different. So that's great.
I was going to say, because it would just be easy to say, just build out the yard. But
It would be, but it kind of ruin a little bit of the ambiance. So
Yeah.
So what was the process? Because a welding shop, the needs in terms of power and drainage and storage and everything are very, very different from a brewery. So at what point did you ever walk in and just say, what have I done?
There are a lot of days we come in and it's not so much what have I done, it's like what do I need to do now to make that work.
it's like there's some juggling that goes on for sure.
Exactly. We had tons of power. We've got power for days. We'll run out of ideas before we run out of power. But the drainage and the plumbing, it was a welding shop, so it had two toilets and a sink in the building. So everything that's in there that involves, so we remodeled the offices into our bathrooms, and so we now have, toilets and sinks added in, for our patrons, and then all of the sinks and all of our water needs and everything, and the drainage that we had to basically cut into the floor and establish all of that. And we kind of ran out. Fortunately, the building was positioned and just enough for us to get the right slope to get everything, all of our drainage, integrated into our current drainage system.
Yeah, I mean, I've never had the privilege of working in a built out for a brewery, so I have to say this one it's not nearly as tricky as other ones I've been in, as far as just the typical water mitigation of brewing is messy, and so it's actually pretty easy with our drain setup the way it is. It's not that bad, so that's a definite plus for the building, is the concrete isn't very strangely sloped in all the wrong places.
So that's great for the building, obviously the city of High Springs is probably going to come in and say something. You're on what is basically a central location. It's a beautiful sort of downtown area, and it does sort of lead towards here. What was the city like when you went up to them and say, hey, we want to purchase this spot and we want to make a brewery?
Well, I'll let Kiffin really take over this.
You're both looking at each other, smiling.
So
that smile of, okay, here we go with this story. So
yeah, I would just say that, I mean, they let us open.
Yes.
And then after that, it was kind of a challenge, but, you know, Kiffin, you take it away.
We're kind of the folk that have the idea, and we've determined where it's going to be, and it's going to be there, and it's really just a matter of the time for it happening is the time it takes for you to realize that it's happening.
Yeah.
And when we decided, hey, we're going to be in High Springs, all right, where's it going to be? We had already gone through some of that discussion when we went to the city and said, we're opening a brewery and we're doing it in this place, and we just need to know what forms to fill out or what these things are, what are the right things to be a business that is coming to town. We're not asking for permission, essentially, as much as where can we do it? And we were in an industrial park, so it was a permitted business. So we pretty much, we're in the industrial park. It's a permissible business. We're going through this process. Obviously, there were folks that just don't like alcohol, and it didn't matter who we were. They didn't want us open. And so we had already kind of gone through some of those steps with the city, developing the relationships with them and letting them know we're not the enemy, and really beginning to build that rapport with them. And so when we shifted to here, we had people that were already on board with us being in town, and they were excited about that as far as the prosperity for the town. And so they were very workable with us being able to get here and be open. When it came to other things, kind of progressively as we've grown, and other things that kind of came as a result of being open, we've butted heads at different times over various things.
I'd love to talk about the mural because you sort of mentioned it, and I'm going to try and put a photo of it up on social media. But with the mural that we're kind of sitting next to, it's sort of, I guess, a portal gator kind of Twilight Zone-y, outer space, High Springs, water flowing celebration. There's a lot going on here, but there was a lot going on in its creation as well.
Right. We have an event called Hops and Shop that we host a couple of times a year, and there was an artist who had an opportunity to come here and participate in the event, and we've been very encouraging of her and supportive of her work and being able to prosper as an artist. She came from Venezuela, and the circumstances that she recalls with the stricture that the government puts on everybody, and the fear that she has related to just personal expression. And so she gifted to us this mural that we have on the wall as a thank you to being supportive of her. And so we agreed, absolutely, put it on the wall. So she came one weekend and began putting it on the wall. The city is in the process, or was in the process at the time, of dealing with murals in public spaces and working through the nuances of the historic district and how art works and how art functions. And they came and had her stop painting the mural. And so we went through that process to go through the permitting process for the mural and being able to deal with, public speech, freedom of speech. And
I was going to say, coming from Venezuela, I would assume that being stopped here would
right, yeah,
be a little scary.
She was terrified, and it really was our role, being the recipients of her gift, to support and defend her. And we had the opportunity to, go in front of the city and really have to wrestle with how the mural is kept. And, on it, we had asked her out of our vanity to include our name on the mural. And so the debate with the city became, is it a sign or some kind of marketing, or is it free speech as artwork? And so in the deliberations of those pieces, the concession was to remove the brewing part. We kept High Springs, to look at the kind of ethereal nature of the artwork and had the opportunity to point out, how black holes, how wormholes work. And, that anybody that comes to High Springs, regardless of where you are and the weirdness that you might find yourself in, is welcome here. And the mural is an expression of our ability to embrace that creativity and one another as we wrestle with the day-to-day.
And then also just interdimensional gators is cool. So
absolutely.
Please make that a beer name.
That's
Interdimensional
that's
gator.
happening.
That's,
there you go.
That has to happen.
This will be the label.
Oh, yeah, it's perfect. There you go.
Like, can we make the waters of Florida a little more scary? Yes, we just did.
Would have made Lake Placid a very different movie.
Oh my God! Yeah. Now I'm over here.
Gator's here. Now it's over there.
Teleportation gator. So you've got the city, obviously, in terms of the municipality. There's obviously also the residents. And what did it take for you to sort of win over and persuade the people of High Springs?
I think that was pretty easy. People were ready for it. They wanted something close, not have to go to Gainesville if they wanted to go to a craft beer, like an actual brewery, because there are places obviously to get craft beer around. But yeah, I think that was easy. There's a couple poo-pooers, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Ain't scared.
Yeah. I think that the opportunities that we have for fundraisers and the work with like the Women's Club and other organizations. We sponsor different sports teams at the schools because my wife's a teacher. I was a teacher. So we have friends at all the schools. And so our kids go to school. And so being able to make those connections and try to create a positive perspective on something that for many may have kind of a dark side. And, being able for our children to be able to wear our shirts to school and not be sent home or forced to change for having them is important to us in making beer not a cuss word and being able to demonstrate that through support through, for the food bank or support to any of the local churches or schools that may want to, have a fundraiser or an event that we're able to give back into the community and demonstrate the family-friendly side of this being a safe space.
Definitely family-friendly for sure.
When we drink, we raise a toast, we're celebrating life. We're also not in agreement for the dark side of alcohol that happens in places.
But every time I come up here, High Springs Brewing is always a gathering place.
Absolutely.
Friends see each other that haven't seen each other in a minute. It's always shaking hands, hugs for people. It's always just a good vibe. Kids running around having fun.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's really been an interesting phenomenon because we've accidentally run into people that we didn't know we were going to see and hadn't seen for 20, 30 years, and we've accidentally run into them here, and they didn't know that we own the place. They're from other places, and then we've converged, and it's been interdimensional and a fascinating experience being able to have what you imagine all of the breweries to be, a unique place for people to converge and share life with one another.
So there we are with part one. Part two, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the legal ramifications of brewing in Florida and how there's some cards that are stacked against Florida's craft breweries that Kiffin and people like him are hopefully trying to change. Come back next week, take a listen to that. In the meantime, if you want to know when that gets released, please do so by following us on social media. We are at Florida Beer Blog on Instagram, Threads, and X, formerly known as Twitter. Facebook, we are still at FL Beer Blog. You can email us at floridabeerblog@gmail.com, and you can find us on the internet at floridabeerblog.com and floridabeerpodcast.com. And when you go to floridabeerpodcast.com, you will see that we are a proud member of the Florida Podcast Network, collecting some of the finest Florida-based and Florida-centric podcasts around the internet. You can find more information on them at floridapodcastnetwork.com. Podcasting app of your choice, and if you do, please make sure to follow us, like and subscribe, and if you could, please leave a nice rating. 5 stars. It helps get the word out about the podcast to everybody else. And if you're nowhere near a podcasting app, we're also on YouTube, which is fast becoming a podcast center. It's kind of amazing, but you can find this and many more of our episodes on YouTube as well by searching Florida Beer Podcast. Our intro announcer is Jeff Brozovich. Our field producer is Steve Pekala. Executive producer for the Florida Podcast Network and Grand High Poobah is Jemmy Legagneur. This is David Butler, your host and author. We will be back next week with part 2 coming from High Springs Brewing in High Springs, Florida. Thank you all so much for listening, and drink Florida Craft.